Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU SCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the university's Faculty of Law. I'm your host, Ajay Shamdasani. This will be our last episode of Regulatory Ramblings, at least for a while. We hope to resume broadcasts in the new year. Today's initial spotlight segment features a discussion with Dr. Lucien van Romburg about an article he recently co-authored with the University of New South Wales law professor Ross Buckley, focusing on retail central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. Following that, we'll be chatting with Professors Dirk Zetska and Marianne Unterstil about a recent article of theirs entitled Towards an EU Impact Investing Framework, that Professor Buckley from the University of New South Wales also co-authored, along with HKU Law's Professor Douglas Arner, who happens to be the team leader for this podcast. But first, Lucien van Romburg's recent article entitled The Need to Address the Broader Social Dimensions in Any Decision to Issue a Retail Central Bank Digital Currency appears in the current edition of the University of New South Wales Law Journal. The abstract reads, "Central banks, in deciding to issue a central bank digital currency, tend to focus on how it might best support their policy objectives. While central banks typically view themselves as being in the service of society, the need for CBDC will usually be assessed within the scope of their primary mandates, traditionally concerned with monetary policy. This is problematic, as grounds for the issue of a CBDC that fall outside this scope may not be considered fully. We suggest that the broader needs of society and the effects of a retail CBDC should be given substantial weight in decisions concerning a potential CBDC. States should collaborate with central banks and other diverse sources of expertise to ensure broad public engagement and participation in deciding whether there is an actual need for CBDC, as well as its design." Lucien van Romburg is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of New South Wales School of Private and Commercial Law, and is a member of its Faculty of Law and Justice. And with that, Lucien, thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much, AJ, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be talking to you about the exciting world of CBDCs today.
Yeah, it's the one of the perennial issues of our time. So what prompted you and Ross to write the article, and why now?
The article actually was motivated by a meeting that Ross and I joined, which was organized by the Reserve Bank of Australia. At that particular time, the Reserve Bank was wanting to receive feedback, particularly from a wide varying scope of academics, on the possibility of issuing a retail central bank digital currency in Australia. And from that meeting, we've researched more widely into the development of CBDCs worldwide, but we do or have focused specifically on how that would see itself in Australia.
This field, the body of literature on CBDCs and virtual assets writ large, it's at this point it's quite substantial, and it's ever growing, or at the very least, it's not insubstantial. What do you feel your piece adds to that?
You're definitely right. The field of, at the moment, the Atlantic Council tracker indicates that 137 countries and currency unions are exploring a central bank digital currency. And of course, with all those countries and currency unions, we of course get the discussion paper in order to scope out what central banks envisage with a CBDC. So our paper, we look at all these developments, and we specifically look at the processes which central banks take in order to decide whether a central bank digital currency, specifically a retail one that would be for the public use, What the actual need for that is, as opposed to the existing payment systems infrastructure. And essentially, what we have found is that the decision to issue a retail CBDC is often viewed through the policy objectives of central banks as well as their traditional mandates. And these policy objectives and mandates are often viewed through monetary policy and not necessarily the actual needs or broader needs of different members of society. And therefore, our article adds the component that the decision to issue a CBDC should be considered much more widely and broader than just through monetary policy.
I can understand the rationale behind wanting to get the perspectives of a wider swatch of society, a wider segment of society, all relevant stakeholders, I believe is the contemporary term that people like to talk about in CSR and ESG matters. But
Yeah.
I guess what I'm wondering is, why is it problematic to only look at CBDC through the lens, through the prism of monetary policy? I mean, there's one quote from your abstract that I want to repeat, which is, "This is problematic as the grounds for the issue of CBDC that fall outside this scope may not be fully considered." Uh, are we to assume, end quote, so are we to assume then that there are reasons beyond the monetary that might necessitate or or at the very least provide a compelling reason to create a CBDC? Because generally speaking, that's how it's thought of, right? As a tool of, as an extension of monetary policy, and that most people are quite comfortable with.
Yeah, well, I think if we look at the traditional roles of central banks in general. So usually we would look at their role in promoting resilient payment systems, supporting, you know, supporting money or at least using a central bank digital currency in order to support the monetary anchor role of central bank money, which of course would be cash, as well as coins in the retail sense. Um, and then also using a CBDC in order to improve cross-border payments. So these would fall within the usual monetary policy roles of a central bank generally. However, there are other policy objectives that may not fit very comfortably within that traditional role, and that could include policy objectives such as fostering innovation, encouraging competition, enhancing financial inclusion, and the main point of our argument hinges on the fact that while central banks may be very well versed in monetary policy, they may not necessarily be well versed in those other policy objectives. And in order to give a perspective that shows what the broader society considers important, um, that's why we specifically state that broader engagement and participation is necessary because there may be certain aspects of issuing a CBDC that are left out of the broader conversation.
Elsewhere in the article, you say, quote, "States should collaborate with central banks and other diverse sources of expertise to ensure broad public engagement and participation in deciding whether there is an actual need for CBDC as well as its design." Two things come to mind, end quote. What do you mean by other diverse sources of expertise? Are you referring to a public-private partnership, or are you referring to other organs of the government, such as the finance ministry or the commerce ministry or other, technocrats within the government, not just the central bank? And beyond that, from that statement, I take it that there may be instances where it's not recommended to issue a CBDC. Could you tackle those 2 points, please?
Yep. So our approach, or at least our suggestion, is that instead of a central bank digital currency being issued solely through monetary policy reasons, that actually there needs to be a more specific need for a central bank digital currency. And secondly, there needs to be a broader public engagement and participation. And the reference to a broader perspective, or at least a broader actors that need to be consulted. That includes governmental bodies, but specifically, we also make reference to other academics. So, academics, of course, not to toot our own horns or my own horn, but academics are, of course, a source of knowledge and expertise. And as the Australian government has done and also plans to do, that consulting with academics is one example of a broader participation that's not just a open call to the public to specify what their views are on this issue. Another example we give is the use of um, participatory juries. Or at least these systems where these issues can be discussed in forums that include a broader section of society. And particularly from an Australian perspective, we have people who still rely on the use of cash. And with the introduction of a retail central bank digital currency, that may um, effectively reduce access to cash. Um, and that may therefore impact people who still rely on cash very heavily. Although we do see worldwide that many countries are introducing cash acceptance mandates, and that includes Australia. There has been a proposal to introduce a cash acceptance mandate that would come into effect on the 1st of January 2026, which would essentially um, make it mandatory for businesses providing essential goods and services to accept cash. So there is a protection on the one hand of the current use of cash, but then there are also these ideas of using central bank digital currency, which would further proliferate the use of digital payments. So we have these two things sort of sitting side to side.
I read with great interest, I mean, almost bemusement about the experience of the Bank of Finland. And as you guys put it, it's a cautionary tale of the importance of the clarity of precise reasons for issuing a retail CBDC. And I don't want to spoil it too much for people because I want them to read the article. But I mean, long and short of it is they were motivated by wanting cost efficiencies and savings. But I mean, again, as a layperson, I took from that intentions matter. That there's an expression sometimes good things can be done for the wrong reasons, and vice versa. So again, in the formulation of any policy, intentions matter. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, I mean that's a very good question. We have very diverging policy views on the issuance of central bank digital currency, and even though there are 137 countries exploring the issue of a central bank digital currency, specifically a retail CBDC, there are very divergent views. In the US, we of course have the Strengthening American Leadership in Digital Financial Technology executive order that was issued in January 2025, essentially banning the development of a central bank digital currency in the US. Yeah. And then, there are various reasons behind that. Essentially what that order did was it cleared the way for there being competition between a US dollar, a stable coin, and other digital currencies. And effectively it, promoted the use of stable coins, at least in the US, through the Genius Act, which was passed in July 2025. So they are very interesting, political reasons for the development or no development of a CBDC from a US perspective. And then we have, the opposite of that in Europe, where, the ECB is pushing very steadily ahead with the issue of a digital euro. And the reasons behind this essentially is, the fear of a loss of sovereignty, which, could potentially happen in relation to the competition with, or not the competition, but at least with Visa and MasterCard in terms of how it controls the payment systems in Europe. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we also have
I mean
China.
that's a key point to note that the existing payment services uh, mechanisms, I mean that their providers are not disinterested parties. That CBDCs, it's been said, might disintermediate them from the equation.
Yes, definitely correct. And there's also a very interesting trend away from developing a retail central bank digital currency and focusing on wholesale digital currencies or CBDCs. And this has been the case in both Australia as well as Hong Kong, where the government is now focusing on developing wholesale CBDC and tokenized CBDC asset markets. So there's just varying differences, and the future of central bank digital currencies is going to largely just depend on what the policy response is. But at the ground of it, especially where there has been an interaction with the public on the decision to issue a retail central bank digital currency, because, as Andrew Dadal has said, he said that money is a constitutional or a social phenomenon, and for the government to introduce a retail CBDC, it's a very personal thing specifically for the public, because there is that extra step in the ways in which money can be used. Um, so yeah, so that's why our article focuses mostly on the retail aspect of a CBDC, and we look at it through the central bank lens, because at the end of the day, central banks have the authority to issue money, and in some instances, they will need additional authority to also issue digital forms of central bank money.
That's a valid point. Several things come to mind, but I mean, now that you've already broached the topic of wholesale versus retail CBDCs, I mean, further into the piece, you take great care to distinguish between them by saying, quote, the arguments for wholesale CBDC are quite different, with wholesale CBDCs potentially offering substantial efficiency gains in cross-border trade transaction payments and capital market transactions. And then you go on to state that with retail CBDCs, those designed for use by the general population, not major banks and corporations, a retail CBDC could be used by households and businesses to affect online transactions and transfers of funds to family and friends. A wholesale CBDC would only be accessible to a limited range of market participants, such as commercial banks, and would be used to affect wholesale payments and settlements. End quote. Okay, see, I mean, it seems straightforward. I mean, kind of like with certain instruments, right? When it comes to certain investments, they only want big players. For example, it might be 10,000 or 100,000 US or above if you want
Mhm.
to get into a particular investment, and so that indicates that they only want high net worth individuals or institutions. I mean, that seems straightforward enough, but ultimately it's the same underlying technology, is it not?
Yes, that is correct. I think it's more related to, well, as you said, the actual volumes that we are dealing with, because of course, with the retail central bank digital currency,
And it's the
um,
same with Hong Kong China Stock Connect that
yeah,
initially it was not intended for retail investors.
yeah, and in my opinion, I think that and the governments have also alluded to this, that it is much easier to, um, you know, install a system relating to wholesale central bank digital currencies, as opposed to the more sort of politicized um, decision to introduce a retail central bank digital currency. Um, so I think it's from that perspective, it makes sense that governments are focusing on wholesale CBDC markets rather than retail CBDCs. Um, but yeah, of course, it's also offering or using this product in a very different way, in respect to wholesale payments. And as you said, it's also marketed, or not necessarily marketed, but it's targeted at very different play or actors such as commercial banks and other large financial institutions that make use of exchange settlement accounts at central banks. So at the end of the day, it utilizes a very specific technology, but the underlying sort of political purpose um, is, it's in varying degrees, it's easier for wholesale CBDCs as opposed to a retail CBDC.
I mean, if one looks at the subtext, am I reading too much into this? But I mean, part of the rationale for not wanting retail investors into something, at least in the initial stages, is the consumer protection aspect. Whereas with the high net worth individuals or institutional investors, the view is they are they ought to be savvy enough and have the means to at least apprise themselves of the risk to know what they're getting into. Whereas with the retail investors, that's always in doubt. And then then there's a whole thing about wealth should not be equated with financial sophistication and all. But am I overstating the case by citing a consumer protection aspect to this?
No, I don't think you are overstating it. I think in terms of the wholesale CBDC market, of course, uh, this type of CBDC will be used by a very select, limited actor, and those essentially would be the commercial banks using exchange settlement accounts in order to effect wholesale transactions or interbank transactions. So these, of course, are sophisticated financial institutions who are licensed and regulated. And of course, within that realm, they would be more than capable of dealing with these types of products. From a retail perspective, I think there is definitely a consumer interest. And I think that relates mostly to the educational aspect. With a retail central bank digital currency, there will have to be lots of education in order to inform the public what exactly a retail central bank digital currency is. And actually, I think a very limited amount of people in the public actually know what the distinction is between the cash that you have in your wallet and the coins, and the money that you have in your bank account. And the money you have in your bank account actually isn't central bank money. It's just a digital promise from your bank that they will make your demand if you need that cash to convert into to convert it into physical cash. So there's a long way to go when it comes to educating the public about the use of retail central bank digital currency, which can also act as a deterrent um, against issuing a retail central bank digital currency. And this was actually the case in the Bahamas when they tried to introduce I think it was the Bahamian central bank digital currency. They did find that it was quite difficult to educate the public on its exact uses, and that's why the rates of use is low, or at least is attributed as one of the factors for the low use of that retail CBDC.
Okay. Further into the piece, you say, quote, our analysis reveals that while central banks serve the public as a whole in carrying out their mandates, their perceptions on the need for CBDC may be restricted by the scope of their primary mandates, which are traditionally concerned with monetary policy and financial stability. This is problematic, as the grounds for and the consequences of the CBDC issuance that fall outside the scope may not be fully considered. end quote. So, I mean, again, this is a recurring theme in your piece. I guess what I'm wondering then is what's the solution? What's the policy? What are the ultimate policy positions that you and Professor Buckley advocate for or support? What would you like to ultimately see done to create a more ideal state of affairs?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think one thing that we do point out specifically is that there needs to be a deeper investigation into the actual need for a central bank digital currency. In some or in most advanced economies, we have very efficient payment systems in place. And whether a retail central bank digital currency is needed to enhance the already efficient payment system is something that really needs more thinking. Um, there is potentially scope for a retail central bank digital currency in, I guess, emerging economies where the infrastructure may not be strong in terms of payments. So the introduction of a retail CBDC would be of benefit in those places. However, that's also not a given. In some emerging economies, there are payment systems that are efficient and in strong use in some jurisdictions. So it really comes down to what the need is. Um, and then secondly, we highlight the collaborative decision making. We really think that the decision for a central bank digital currency should not be solely within the remit of a central bank, and it should actually be extended much further to other facets of the government. And essentially, it needs to be a collaborative decision because of the very big impact that it will have, particularly on people who are not included in the formal financial system. And then public engagement. So we need to have a more legitimate, a public participation process. There are multiple examples of a public participation process for a retail central bank digital currency that already indicates that the central bank has made the decision. In some cases, there's even uh, plans to, have what the design of a CBDC could be as well. And it just begs the question: is that a legitimate public participation process where there's already such detailed plans to introduce a CBDC, including what its model could be? So there really just needs to be a legitimate attempt at incorporating a broader scope of perspectives into that decision.
Now, I like that you, at least in your statement, you alluded to the need for financial inclusion. What is the intersection, or what are the implications of CBD for financial inclusion of CBDCs? What will the new age of CBDCs herald for financial inclusion? Will it be a net positive or a net negative?
Sure, that's also a very good question, and I think it is quite also a controversial perspective on the impact that a retail central bank digital currency could have on financial inclusion, because one could also argue that it could exclude people even further from the formal financial system. We have people living in remote areas, people who still make use of cash and coins in order to effect their daily transactions. And if we have another sort of digital instrument that is being introduced by the government or by the central bank, this could further exclude those people from the financial system because it could lead to less cash being used in society, or at least less cash being circulated and withdrawn from banks. So there is, sort
Thus,
of.
thus it would seem disintermediated banks, cutting them out of the process.
Yes, that's also correct. There's also the fear that commercial bank deposit accounts will no longer be used, or at least that people would withdraw that money and then deposit it into central bank accounts. However, there are certain contingencies that can protect against that, such as rules on the limits that can be deposited into central bank accounts for the purposes of a retail CBDC. So they definitely are rules that can be introduced in order to mitigate against that risk as well.
In the time we've got left, is there anything you feel we didn't cover, or anything you'd like to share and press upon our audience? I mean, the floor is yours.
Um, yeah, sure. I mean, I think, I think I referred to this a bit earlier, but the reason for the introduction of a retail central bank digital currency, um, it will largely be dictated by whatever policy aim, is at the forefront of the government at that particular time. And as we allude in the greater message in our article, is that that is quite dangerous because if we are pushing ahead with the technology without really understanding the underlying need for it and what the effect of the introduction of that technology would be on the broader society and all the groups in society that may be affected by it, that there is a danger of the introduction of that technology that may lead to very negative consequences in the future. So, yeah, overall, I think that's the main message of our article. But at the same time, we also see governments protecting the continued use of cash. And I think that these two objectives of introducing a retail central bank digital currency that can protect central bank, sovereignty, will develop alongside efforts to protect the continued use of cash, and those will, I feel, they will sort of run parallel to each other, and they're obviously going to be um, conflicts between those two things as well. So it will be interesting to see what this space is. And then, as I also said, there's a trend towards developing a wholesale central bank digital currency. So it's going to be interesting to see those developments in future as well.
Very much so. Lucien, thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you very much for having me and for the very insightful questions.
And we're back. We're chatting with Professor Dirk Zetske and Marianne Unterstal about a recent article of theirs entitled Towards an EU Impact Investing Framework. Amongst their co-authors are HKU Law's very own and the team leader of our podcast, Professor Douglas Arner, as well as Professor Ross Buckley of the University of New South Wales in Australia. Professor Zetske is a professor in financial law with the Faculty of Law and Economics and Finance at the University of Luxembourg, as well as the head of their law department. Marianne Unterstal is a doctoral researcher at the Faculty of Law and Economics and Finance, also at the University of Luxembourg. The abstract to their piece reads, Sustainability-oriented investors want to pay for impact, not compliance. We analyze the regulatory challenges and opportunities for impact investing. We find that advancing impact investing requires a departure from the EU sustainable finance framework's prevailing input orientation and an adjustment of EU asset management law towards an EU impact finance framework. In its current form, the EU SFF overemphasizes exclusion using rule-based ex-ante definitions of sustainable business herein termed input. If a large share of global capital follows these rules, unsustainable firms' capital costs will increase, furthering innovation of sustainable alternatives. However, the EU SFF alone cannot prevent global capital flows into unsustainable investments, and non-EU countries follow different approaches. Although the EU SFF encourages, in effect, the sale of unsustainable EU businesses to non-EU firms, its input orientation has not helped the planet. The same activities continue elsewhere, often under weaker environmental and social standards, leaving the planet worse off. Further, the EU SFF's disregard for proven ex-post impacts risks large-scale capital misallocation and impact washing, whereas the input focus comes at the cost of investments paired with audited evidence positive ESG impacts ex post. The authors argue for shifting EU financial regulation from input to proven impact, yet rather than adding a new product category, they advocate recognizing positive impacts through 5 fine-tuned steps that simplify EU financial regulation, taking into account regulatory developments in the UK and Switzerland. These include abolishing the link between do no significant harm under the taxonomy regulation and the sustainable finance disclosure regulation, simplified reporting aligned with product materials and the emerging IFRS disclosure standards, introducing a new proportionality threshold for mid-sized AIFMs and revising ESMA's rules on fund names. And with that, we turn to the authors themselves. Dirk and Marianne, thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Ajay.
Good morning. It's a wonderful experience to be here with you.
Well, Dirk, let me turn to you first. What compelled you to write the article at this time?
Yeah, thank you, Ajay. So maybe I need to provide some background of our research environment in Luxembourg. My position in Luxembourg is not only that of a law professor, but also the holder of the ADA chair in financial law and inclusive finance. One of our core mission at that chair is to examine the impact of financial law on society, on developing countries, but also on sustainability matters at large. And as part of the research agenda, what we found quite striking over the last years, that a lot of efforts had been put by market actors, by industry, into meeting the very high reporting standards and data gathering standards of the European Sustainable Finance Framework. But when we were looking for evidence that this kind of framework had achieved a noticeable impact, we didn't find any study that this actually mattered. And that was the background when Marianne, Douglas, Ross, and myself were thinking, well, isn't this an odd world? We want to achieve something. There's a lot of regulatory investment into getting into, let's say, pro-sustainability environment. And all we get is cost of regulation, i.e. compliance. And that was the starting point when we basically looked into the reasons why this is possibly the case. And when you now need to consider the European regulatory environment, there is a commitment towards sustainability. And there's also probably the most effective and the most resourced regulator in the world for these type of things. And then we were kind of looking into the reasons, and we found that there is a fundamental misconception that you can press basically market actors into a regulatory framework which looks at the beginning of the investment chain. So basically something that we will lay out a bit later, probably. But let's say you have basically a list of eligible investments, and these lists were defined by the regulator. So the regulator, rather than the market, defined where the next step of innovation takes place. And on that basis, this was seen or defined in the law as sustainable. And of course, we are researchers. That means we were looking for the interaction between this legislative framework and the desirable outcome for the planet. And of course, right now is a good time for these type of studies, because in Europe, there's an ongoing debate about revising the European Sustainable Finance Framework. And we wanted to make a contribution that if we change the European Sustainable Finance Framework, it will be changed in the right direction, and a direction that achieves impact. And of course, the overhaul of the first generation of European sustainable finance law is a trend which you don't only observe in Europe, but you also see it in Switzerland, you see it in UK, and probably other countries as well, which try to use financial law to channel capital into more sustainable investments. And within that overall context, we believe our contribution is rightly placed at the right time to make a decent influence on the regulatory environment and probably also the future path of sustainable finance regulation globally.
You know what struck me about your piece was, and I had to go over this twice, and I'm saying that as someone with a law degree and 2 LLMs. At times, I felt it was a little over my head, but it was very deep, and that's why it required a second reading. Uh, I mean, clearly it was about impact investing and sustainable finance, and a lot of it was over my head. But I mean, it gave it, it gave insight into the state of play in terms of the European regulations, which I don't think I'd seen explicated, delineated in as much detail as I'd seen anywhere else. And again, that's where people tend to get bogged down into which is the details. And I guess that's a nice segue into my next question, Marion, which is, who's your intended audience?
Yes, I think we can name here basically 3 relevant actors. First of all, of course, regulators. Second, the impact in investing industry itself. And third, we're looking also to reach out for academics. Starting with the first point, with the regulators, I think comes clear from what Dirk said towards the point in time that we see all over the world this change in the sustainable finance frameworks, in the style of the regulation that we use, that we had after the Paris agreements and the seeking for improving on the SDGs, that we had so many regulation that was extremely detailed in Europe, but also in other parts of the world that were trying to achieve impact basically through the usage of the capital markets on sustainability factors. And here we want to raise the awareness that this trend of this overcomplicating things by the regulators needs to change, but not only by cutting back on the regulation as we see now in Europe. There we have this simplification agenda that many of the norms are just being cut out, but that we see this as a chance not only to cut back but also to improve. And we want to improve that by introducing the refocus on positive aspects, on achieving measurable positive impacts in the world. And I think to raise this awareness among regulators in the world is the most important aspect. And then, of course, itself, the impact investing industry. As a second actor, it's always important for us as academics to involve in somewhat of a knowledge exchange with those that are directly involved. And I think here we can also see something that's really important in terms of drafting the legislation. What we had now so far is basically an approach from the top, from the European legislator down to the impact investing industry. And often these rules were drafted in a very short period of time, and thereby often not perfectly fitting to the need of the impact investing industry. And what we want to achieve is basically a reversal of that we want to take the knowledge of the impact investing industry for forming future regulation, for having better, maybe also, or of course also fewer indicators, but then fewer indicators that really fits to the needs and really fit to what investors want to see. And what they want to see is not only compliance, but want to see this real measurable impact. And then lastly, of course, other academics to further this regulatory discussion, to further the knowledge exchange. I think these are the most important actors we want to reach.
Dirk, turning to you, ultimately, what would you like policymakers and regulators to do in response to reading your work? I mean, what are the policy outcomes you seek? What would the ideal state of affairs look like in your view?
Again, we need to take a step back and need to understand what works and what doesn't work in sustainable finance. We have a large-scale push of mainstream finance into sustainable finance by so-called exclusionary techniques. Exclusionary techniques are investment approaches where you just do not invest in, let's say, a type of blacklist or brown list of investments. These type of investment approaches, to our best knowledge, have achieved very little for the planet, if not nothing. We are not aware of a single study arguing that this type of investment approach has made a fundamental impact on the planet in a positive way.
So is the ESG approach, is ESG investing misguided?
Well, ESG is a very broad, very undefined term. But when you break it down into investment approaches, then the core insight that we came at when it looks to so-called exclusionary approaches, so that means you exclude brown investments, you exclude investments into weapons of war, you exclude a number of other things that you do not find sustainable. We found that this has not made any impact. And the reason is that the capital pools that are outside of this exclusionary approach is still too large. So, of course, if you would have a fully coordinated world that applies this approach, including the Gulf region, including many other parts of the world which are beyond the EU regulatory remit, then such an exclusionary approach could potentially achieve something, so in the theoretical framework, but that is not the case. More than 80% of the world's capital is outside of the regulators' reach, of the EU regulations' reach. And that means these exclusionary approaches are not aligned, they're not coordinated globally, and that means they achieve very little. When you don't get money from Europe, you get it elsewhere. And that means we found that the mainstream ESG approach, which is based on exclusion, has very little to zero effect, at least nothing that we could measure. And that turned our attention to who could make an impact in a world that is not coordinated. And that shift of focus to impact investing. And this is a growing industry. There's a bit of definitional uncertainty, but we believe it's now reaching close to 1.5 trillion euro, and that is a significant amount. It's strongly growing. But there are problems in that industry, and that industry suffers from small scale. It suffers from high operational costs because you really need to do the dirty work on the ground. And of course, these investments go into the brown investment industry and try to make them from very dark brown into light brown. Just to give you an example, so assume you have a lorry that uses 25 liter of gas. If you can bring this down to 5 liter, you have saved 80% of the emissions, correct? You're still not green, but it's much better for the planet than doing nothing, which is the alternative. Because when you go for the more ambitious approaches like electric vehicles or hydrogen or something like that, have fun doing that in the middle of the African desert. And as an impact investor has to go where it really hurts, where it's really uncomfortable. These investment approaches are hard to scale, and the operational costs are relatively high for everyone involved. But at the same time, when they achieve what they promise to achieve, their outcome is measurable. And it is definitely a contribution that is much better than going from 99% efficiency to 100 or from 95 to 97, as the exclusionary approaches can achieve in the best of all scenarios.
So then, is the lesson for the impact investor that, at least for the foreseeable future, incremental improvements to the world is the best you can hope for?
Perfection is for paradise. That means the world as it is imperfect, and we need to look at where we can make an impact rather than where we can comply with rules. And this is exactly the focus point of our article, that we say, let's shift attention to where we can really make a change. And this type of change, of course, shouldn't be idealistic. No one wants to waste money, or if you want to waste money, you will go into a foundation and give a donation to a foundation. That means it must be an investment approach, it must be scalable, and regulation should not hamper these approaches, but be neutral, if not further these approaches. And that's exactly the core policy outcome which we seek, that EU policymakers, and usually we have a Brussels effect, that means other regulators will follow, that they pay more attention to these type of impact investors and draft regulation in a way that the already high costs from these investment approaches are not overburdened with additional compliance costs. And that is, the main policy outcome, that we highlight the need for impact investing, and that we show that something which is apparently easy and apparently normal for mainstream turns into a problem when you have to show that you truly make an impact.
Marianne, care to chime in?
Yes. I think with this reform that we're looking for, we made 5 arguments for it and 5 points we want to change. Of course, I think everyone who's interested hopefully finds the time also to look into the article. As you mentioned, it gets quite technical, but I will try to break these more main points down and maybe not the biggest legal speech. And the first one is basically, I hope, what is a clever trick. Right now, as Dirk said, the regulation overly focuses on negative impacts, on excluding these negative impacts. And our idea is just to change the wording of the law in that regard, that you're not supposed to regard only these negative impacts, but just leave out the negative and just regard principal impacts in general. Thereby, we change basically from this negative exclusionary perspective to a positive perspective, because if you need to consider all principal impacts, you also need to consider, of course, positive impacts. And that is what Dirk made in his example, the saving of the, what was it, 20 liters of diesel. If we have the engines and bring that down, that would be the positive impact, and thereby shifting the focus. I think this is the main aspect, and just by changing one word. And the other aspects, the other points that we have, is decouple further from this approach that the EU chose with basically the EU taxonomy regulation. That is basically just the regulation that provides the definition for what is sustainable, and how it does that is by providing thousands and thousands of pages where you have these technical screening criteria, where you write down, okay, I need for this activity to build a water pipe, I need to have this material, I need to have that, it's allowed to have that many liters running through that. And this is just extremely difficult to understand, and we would like to move away from that and only report on those negative aspects that are really relevant. Basically, that you refocus on, did I do something worse? And if not, I do not need to report on that. Only if I did something worse, my main outcome, and thereby we further change towards these positive aspects. And the other
maybe Marian, just to give you here an example to our audience.
Yes.
If you, for instance, invest in the jungle, trying to, for instance, contribute in a positive way to a rainforest, reporting on your impact on the maritime environment is probably costly and very difficult, because you lack the data on that. You focus on the rainforest rather than the maritime environment. But the current framework would ask you also to report on your impact on the maritime environment, because there's a full reporting list of 186 sustainability factors on which you have to report. And that renders impact investing super costly, because you want to focus on the rainforest, but must gather data on the maritime environment.
Definitely. And I think that is, again, very well connected with the issue of going to the place where it hurts. And usually these places where it hurts, where we can, the biggest change there, also the data availability is the worst. That if you're having an impact project in sub-Saharan Africa, it will be extremely difficult also to gather this data, because we're not in Europe anymore, where you have a company with hundreds of lawyers that make this data, and economists, and therefore I think the problem is even more appalling.
But Marian, this is an interesting way how you say it, you don't have a company in Europe that makes these data. Yeah, this is exactly the problem, probably in Europe as well. So when you think of impact investing within Europe, you may get 186 data points. You just don't know where they come from. And this is a more general point we also make in a different piece of research that we have put out. But on building on that analysis, that much of these 186 data points have been made up somewhere, we believe it's all the more crucial to cut down the mandatory reporting to those data that you really, really have your hands on, and that can really say something about your core activity rather than side effects. and ancillary in effects that are somehow connected to sustainability, but not to what you're actually investing in.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Dirk, because we covered this earlier this year on the program, and I believe the complaint from the business community, the corporate community in Europe is, you're asking us to give too many measurements, too many barometer readings, too many yardsticks, too many indicia. This level of reporting, this level of measurements is proving to be crippling. It's not practical. And
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And of course, think of it, when you want to achieve too many things at the same time, you achieve nothing. Then you pull in 186 directions at the same time. So the idea which helps the planet, and this is a core idea of our paper, you need to go into one direction, focus on that direction, and avoid side effects. An example we give in the paper is, for instance, if you, for instance, want to improve, let's say we take a social component, let's say you want to further female banking, then what does this have to do with the bee population? Of course, if the female clients now use your credit to buy pesticides all the way, then you have a negative impact on the bee population. So you may want, when providing the credit program, exclude certain uses of your finance. But that doesn't mean you have to measure the bee population and report on the bee population, because it's not the first thing that you would think of when you provide credit to females, correct? And that is something that we say that we want to understand the traditional do no significant harm criteria, which is normal in sustainable finance, that we want to be that people shall understand it in the normal sense, not in a regulatory sense. In the normal sense, do no significant harm means when you do something, exclude something, anything that's reasonably connected to your core activity. It doesn't mean to cover 186 different dimensions of sustainability, including the maritime environment, including the bee population, including a lot of other social and environmental factors we haven't yet touched upon today.
Gathering that extraneous data, it can be useful, possibly down the road in the future. It can be very interesting, but it almost reminds me of what my law professor in evidence law once said to one of my fellow students, which was, everything in the universe is connected to everything else. But if you didn't have relevancy rules, if you didn't have some form of filtration in the discovery process, there'd be no end to this. Trials would go on forever. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Materiality is what makes reporting efficient. Yeah. So think of traditional accounting rules. You wouldn't have to report immaterial facts in accounting. And when it comes to sustainability accounting, we should also focus on material facts for your investment. And of course, this materiality threshold has been disregarded with this please report on everything approach. And this is one of our main targets of our paper, that we say, how can we rectify it? Yes, let's go back to materiality. Let's focus really on your core investment activity and everything that's reasonably related to it, rather than a kind of catch-all reporting, which is nice for scientists, and but it's hardly helping the planet in this way.
Fair enough. I mean, clearly gathering all that data is it's time and it's resource consuming in its own right. Marion, did you want to say something?
Yes. Maybe to just add a small point on that. Our idea is also that if we still, after that, still have data gaps, we can think about maybe using public entities, public institutions that focus on certain aspects that can provide data in a specific sector. For example, if you have the water agency that can provide estimates what a certain project, building windmills, building, I don't know, new leverage system, what impact would that have on water, on the water quality, so on. And with these estimates, you can simplify basically this extremely tedious and granular data gathering that is currently required.
And in our research, on that basis, we say, let's put the burden of proof around. So if in the officially available estimates, there's no indicator that you harm, let's say, the bees, then let's not put the focus of reporting on that. It's not about saying that bees are unimportant. It's just the question whether the bee population is the most material part of your activity. And there are certain investment approaches which are just unrelated to bees. Just think of everything happens in the ocean. There are hardly any bees. So from that perspective, we need to focus our resources on the core activity. And that is probably the gist of the paper. We have achieved a lot of things, but we maybe spread our resources too broadly, too widely. And let's get back to materiality. That's the core of the paper.
Materiality is the order of the day. So with that in mind, what are the key takeaways of your article? What main observations or conclusions should people keep in mind walking away from having read it?
Yeah, maybe let's start with the sentence that you were so kind to cite in the beginning.
Yeah,
we want to highlight that investors want to pay for impact, but they're unwilling to pay for compliance. And as part of our research, we spoke with a number of investors, and they always told me, why should I pay for all these lawyers when I have no evidence that I get as an outcome a better world? I can waste my money in many ways, but I'm interested in impact. I'm willing to invest into an environmentally and socially conscious investment model, but I want to have clear evidence that what I do matters. And this is exactly our starting point, that we looked into the research, that we looked into the data available, and they just tell us there's no impact. And then, of course, the key reason, if you want to invest into impact rather than compliance, how do we get there? The second takeaway is that impact investing is so-called output-oriented. We mean by that impact has to be measured after your investment activity and not before, because no regulator in the world can predict how things develop. Of course, there must be a kind of investment proposition, and to use almost metaphorical expression, there must be a kind of theory of change, how your investment achieves the positive impact. But the most important part comes after the investment has been made, the ongoing controlling, the monitoring, making sure that the investment targets doesn't deviate from its commitment. So let's say what comes after the investment is more important in our view than the initial promises. Everyone who has worked in investment and everyone who works in financial law knows that promises are cheap, but meeting the promises is costly. And this is exactly the basis of the impact investing that we want to further. We want to make sure that there are safeguards in place, that promises given in the sustainability space are also fulfilled, and so that investors can trust, if they want to further a certain sustainability development goal, that they actually are not left alone after the money has been invested. And of course, impact investing means that this is also not transitory. It is a permanent task of investing. So you can't say, if I go into, let's say, gender matters or brown matters, that this is just a temporary thing. So you kind of pacify extremists in environmental matters by saying, well, we will make the diesel go away. Whenever you have been in a less developed part of the world, you will understand there's no way that you ever will get away with fossil fuel. Of course, the relative share of fossil fuel will shrink if in certain parts of the world where it's possible we go to renewables, but the diesel will stay. And the reason is simply the infrastructure surrounding renewables is in parts of the world just very costly. And let me give you an example. Think of the North Pole and think of solar energy at the North Pole. Now you can say no one should be at the North Pole, but of course in the North Pole, half of the year it's dark. So developing renewable approaches to move at the North or the South Pole is super challenging. And then, of course, you can think about replacement technologies like hydrogen and similar things. Yes, they may develop over time, but it will be unrealistic to think that the 8 billion people on the planet will ever be 100% green. But this is not what the planet needs, correct? The planet needs that we improve where we have the largest and the most significant polluters. This is where we need to change, and that may look differently in different countries. In countries, let's say in Europe or maybe in the US or in China, there the renewables may provide the answer. But in countries in Africa and South America, where infrastructure is yet about to be developed, there may be staying within a brown asset, but making that brown asset more efficient is the answer for generating impact. And then, of course, and that is something that lies within the logic of professional investment in the first place, investors only get impact if the costs of the investing is basically lesser than the potential output of that investing. And for that, law and regulation should not impose additional costs, but the role of law should be to emphasize the key aspects in making such an investment as efficient and as scalable as possible. And for that, we need official recognition of positive impacts rather than negative impacts. We need simplified but very focused reporting, and we need to achieve also proportionality for smaller managers, because many smaller managers together can grow into larger ones and create collectively a positive impact. That also draws on one piece of the analysis that we looked at, is that the size of many impact investors is still relatively small, because in order to apply an impact approach around the world, you need to have a significant human capital. And of course, human capital is expensive, and that means if we kind of further exclusionary approaches rather than impact approaches, we put a kind of double burden on the already challenging impact environment.
Well, I guess that's the perennial concern, isn't it? At what point does the cost of compliance and risk management kill the underlying economic rationale for an investment?
Absolutely. Just think of it. When you want to waste money, you may give it to by way of donation. So what we are talking here about is investing approaches, and investing approaches are always return after costs. And if the compliance costs take a significant share of the investment return, and you have already as an implicit part of investing that you need more people on the ground to measure the impact, to collect the data in your core field, then let's avoid that we burden them also with immaterial, irrelevant data, given the size and given the investment approach they apply. So in a way, we hope that our paper contributes to making impact the new North Star of EU sustainable finance, and in that way also sustainable finance approaches globally, rather than meeting certain label criteria or meeting any type of regulatory criteria. Law as such is just a tool, and an inefficient tool needs to be reformed. And that now goes back to one thing that we mentioned at the beginning. There is a fundamental change right now of the EU sustainable finance framework because of the push for simplification. And we believe if we have now access to legislation, then let's get these reforms right, correct? Let's make sure that impact is what goes back to, or what defines the core mission of sustainable finance. And in this regard, it's also interesting to note that some of our ideas have been picked up by the European Commission, so and others will still need a little bit of fine-tuning, but it seems to be that the regulatory train moves into the right direction.
Yes, if I may add my final words to that, I think what we're looking for, and maybe getting back to the beginning, that we see reforms all over the world. It's not only the Europe, but Europe, of course, always a front runner. But with this paper, I think we really have the chance to not only reshape Europeans' regulation, but hopefully set a positive standard that goes in the direction that can be replicated all over the world, and thereby makes a way bigger change than only in Europe.
The overall idea of sustainable finance is that we improve the planet. And if we have set up regulatory models that look nice, but don't help the planet, they have missed their core mission. They failed in their core mission. And if our paper achieves to bringing back the core focus of sustainable finance, a positive impact into the mind of the regulators, then we have achieved what we want to achieve.
Well, it's an ongoing discussion, and one I hope we can continue to have into the new year. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ajay.
Thank you, Ajay.
And to our listeners, thank you. Until next time.